This is Yesterzine, the monthly magazine show about monthly magazines. We take a magazine from the golden age, play the games they like most and least, and flip through to find out what gaming was like when every second game was a cartoony platformer. No less so this month either. You join us in December 1992 with CPC specialist magazine Amstrad Action. The gaming heaven and hell are both examples of said subgenre, and our cover star Dizzy is of course famous for starring in several more. But that's not all he did. We'll sort the cartoon wheat from the cartoon chaff this month on Yesterzine. People paying attention may realise 1992 is getting a bit late in the 8-bit market, and in the specific case of the CPC this month, that marked the always slightly worrying time for a format, as Amstrad Action became officially the last UK CPC magazine, with the demise of the short-lived CPC Attack, itself a continuation of the cancelled official magazine. Amstrad Action are bullish of course, marking the event with a "The Readers Have Spoken" story, but they will have known as well as anyone it's not the best sign. Especially as elsewhere on the same news page they talk about bargain CPC Plus packs for a shade over £120 that come with a monitor and a shed-load of games. If that wasn't evidence enough of slightly lacklustre sales, then the name of the company being Universal Trade Surplus will perhaps also serve as a clue. Elsewhere this month, Future launched GamesMaster magazine, printing an optimistic 350,000 copies of issue 1, which contrasts reasonably well with AA's figure of about 1/10 of that, although that had been impressively largely stable for about 4 years. Amstrad Action though was about to start a fairly sharp decline. 2 months from now, long-term editor Rod Lawton would move on, and the magazine would never really recover, lasting another 30 issues and closing in mid-1995 with the most accidentally hilarious inadvertent last issue headline of all time. That would have been Amstrad Action's worst era ever if it wasn't for their choice of who to feature in their first hero section, which has aged about as well as the CPC itself. Christmas season 1992 though still brought software support for the machine. Codemasters launched a compilation of the adventures of Not Dizzy, one of which is counting as our gaming heaven. There was a major cartoon license in the shape of Count Duckula 2, which gets a mere 86% less than the best Codemasters game. And the original incarnation of the legendary Football Manager series gets a disappointing third entry that is only rescued from ridicule by the combined effects of this episode's lengthy runtime and the game I just mentioned. But to talk about Not Dizzy, we're going to have to talk about Dizzy, because there's going to be plenty of people coming to this, especially console-owning gamers and you young'uns, who might not even have the faintest clue who Dizzy was. Dizzy is a series of platform adventure games that started on the 8-bit home computers in the UK in the late 80s. The character was created by the brothers Oliver, Philip and Andrew, who you may have encountered when we last looked at Amstrad Action and the story of Codemasters back in episode 16. Dizzy is an egg with hands and feet, don't think about it too hard. He wasn't deliberately so initially, it was just a way to get a recognisable facial expression into a tiny 8-bit character. Everyone assumed the egg thing and they ran with it. The twins designed and wrote the first 3 mainline Dizzy games, primarily on the CPC and Spectrum, before moving on to try and take the series onto the games consoles, where Codemasters thought there was money to be made. And to be fair, they were right. Just that money was mostly to be made from micro machines than the unsuccessful releases of Fantastic Dizzy and Dizzy the Adventurer. More correctly, Codemasters also thought there was money to be made from the supposedly dying computers too. And 4 more mainline Dizzy games were produced for those machines, chiefly by a new company called Big Red Software, who were already known to Codemasters. The console games were mostly pieced together from various pieces of the computer ones. Fantastic Dizzy has bits from the first 5 games in, and Dizzy the Adventurer is essentially an uprated remake of the 6th game, Prince of the Yoke Folk. I told you they embraced the egg thing. The series ended with the release of Crystal Kingdom Dizzy in 1992 for a couple of reasons. Firstly, 7 main series games in 5 years means there was a bit of fatigue to the whole thing. And secondly, because while all the other games had been budget releases for £3 or £4 on the 8-bit machines, Crystal Kingdom was full price, meaning a tenner on 8-bit, and a full £25 British on the Amiga, for a game that was really just another Dizzy. By accounts it sold okay, at least initially, but there was a backlash, and Codemasters clearly thought it was time to make a graceful exit. The console adventure hadn't gone according to plan either. Fantastic Dizzy found itself caught up in some legals. We'll have to go into it another time, but Codemasters were the creators of the Game Genie cheat device, and Nintendo were not happy. Whether it was really the Game Genie specifically, or the fact that Codemasters had teamed up with Can America and found a way to release NES games without paying Nintendo their license fee, is a debate. But the resulting argument delayed Fantastic Dizzy to beyond its planned Christmas release, and it didn't recover. Those unlicensed NES games work like this in the UK. A miniature pass-through cart into which you plug any legitimate Nintendo licensed game, and then plug the whole thing into your NES. On boot, the Codemasters cart gets out of the way and lets the NES think it's running the legit game before taking over again. In the US, Can America produced the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, which contained all the common components of a NES cart, including a dodgy copy of that security chip. Smaller NES carts with just the game bits on were sold for much cheaper than a standard game. But by that point, the NES was over the hill, and hedging their bets by producing standalone cartridges as well as the deck and its mini-carts was enough to kill Can America as a company. The last gasp on console Dizzy didn't go much better. In an effort to recoup some cash, Codemasters decided to wang 3 Dizzy games onto a cart for the Game Gear and Master System. In the end, only the former actually got a release, and its rarity today suggests that did not work at all. But in that, we uncover another reason for the Dizzy saturation. Because alongside those 7 reasonably famous adventure games, Dizzy was tarted about the place even more effectively than Nintendo have done with Mario in recent years. In those 5 years, alongside a main series entry roughly every 9 months, there are another 6 spin-off games in other genres, and it's those we're actually here to look at today. Fast food. Dizzy was only 2 games old when this appeared. Written by the Oliver twins, which as mentioned isn't more than could be said for some of the later real Dizzy games, Fast Food is a maze game which isn't really a Pac-Man ripoff, but tries very, very hard to convince you that it is. For a start, there are 4 enemies. They are green, yellow, pink and blue. They have different personalities and names, stop me if you've heard this one before. The actual gameplay is where differences emerge. You're not clearing a maze as such, but simply collecting all the food, which worryingly also moves around the maze. I think I'd possibly suggest that burger is a little undercooked. Horrifyingly, the manual, alongside the enemies, also describes the personalities of the food, and I don't know which one is the worst. For instance, there's the pizza.
Pizzas don't mind being eaten. That's life when you're a pizza. They're fairly easy to catch.
I've never thought to ask a pizza's life goals before, but now I'm wondering if I've deprived quite a lot of pepperoni of the chance to go to university and train as a rocket surgeon just because it accepted its lot in life.
Burgers are blind, so they travel around the maze not knowing where Dizzy is. This makes them easy to eat.
Well, that's not disturbing at all. No one's asking what the burger's view is on any of this. They're just easy to hunt because they're always bumping into walls and no one thinks to fund guide chips for the blind burger.
Milkshakes are the easiest of all. They want to be drunk. They actually come to you.
Well, I am just glad I could help.
Chickens just don't want to be eaten. They're fast and they will run away from you. The only way to catch them is to head them off.
A reminder at this point that Dizzy is supposed to be the hero of this adventure. Quite apart from anything else, he's going to be a hero with severe food poisoning if the chickens are still able to move around when he eats them. And hold up, Dizzy's an egg. There are multiple questions raised by him eating chickens. I guess we've never specified exactly what kind of egg Dizzy is, but it's not like he looks like a quail egg or anything. So, that's murder and cannibalism. Tuck in, children. The weirdness is partially explained by the fact this was not a Dizzy game until late on. It was apparently supposed to be a marketing tie-in for the UK roadside diner chain Happy Eater, and was going to star their mascot, this happy chappy, who I'm sure would have absolutely killed any accusations of ripping off Pac-Man stone dead instantly. As to the quality of Happy Eater, UK viewers should merely consider that they were unable to beat Little Chef, and in fact were ultimately bought and closed by that chain in 1997. US viewers? Oh, I'm not even sure where to start here. Okay, imagine taking on Walmart in a most classy customers contest and losing. Given the game took all of 3 weeks total to write by all accounts, you wonder how a deal could be struck and fall through in that kind of time. The game itself is somehow really great. This is the CPC version, of course, and it's got some additional features like various condiments that affect the battlefield, as well as the classic shields, which in a coincidental and non-copyright infringing way do exactly the same as the power pill in Pac-Man. All this, combined with very dynamic maps, leads to quite an engaging game. There's 30 levels, and they're all fairly short, but there's scope for a much deeper game than Pac-Man here. For instance, the monsters can't pass through your food targets, so if you get it right, you can actually use them as shields. The power pill-like bonuses also sometimes move around the map themselves, and again, are solid. What's not quite solid are some of the thinner walls, which Dizzy alone can pass through, giving you an escape from pursuers in a way you don't normally get in Pac-Man. Some of the tight maps require all these skills, with the ghosts essentially having to be bypassed like you're playing the adventure game or something, using their AI to trick them into going up a passage that allows you to slip into a new area of the map by what might be the only route, and literally playing a game of chicken with a chicken. It's not a super hard game, I've seen over half of it already, and even resetting an entire level rather than just restarting you a la Pac-Man doesn't make it too complex. It blats along nicely though, rewarding you with a cute little sequence every 3 levels completed, which are very nearly as cute as the manual going so far as to call them cartoons. It's a laugh, albeit a slightly slow plodding one. But as a £3 budget game in 1989, I'm thinking Happy Eater missed out on a trick here, in much the same way as they also passed on items like antibacterial spray and making any money. We know Amstrad Action liked this originally, because their review is quoted in the manual, Trent and Webb throwing the game a solid 87%. I can't disagree, really. The 16-bit ones are a little different, with recognisable locations, although an egg chasing a burger around a graveyard does rather feel like the kind of dream you have after eating entirely too much cheese. Alternatively, you could choose the Nintendo Switch Reboot, yes, you heard that right, released late last year by the Olivers themselves as a lockdown distraction product. Quick snacks. Never ones to let an idea that made money sit for more than 2 seconds, the next spin-off Dizzy was also a puzzle game with at least some Pac-Man-y overtones that involved Dizzy eating various foodstuffs. Luckily for us, in this one there is no danger of Dizzy eating his mum. Or your mum, another reason he's a unique character. It's mostly what appears to be fruit. The aim is pretty similar though, collect all the stuff in the level, don't get caught by the now more numerous but unnamed bad guys. The difference is now the level is dynamic. Don't like your route to somewhere? Create one. Virtually all the blocks can be moved to create a path and kill enemies. Weird thing though, is it me or is this somewhat uglier than the early game, at least in this CPC form? It's also got that needlessly cheap trick of having a control reversing power down, which lasts for ages and persists through deaths. In both the episode and my personal chronology, we spent way too long on fast food, and I just don't get the same draw here. This was apparently specifically made because it could be made quick, and even though development dragged on a bit, you do just feel the love wasn't there. Sure, they bashed out fast food quicker than their lunch order, but it feels like they bashed it out while giving a crap. This doesn't have the personality. A solid bit of 8-bit budget action still though. If this was your haul from the weekly trip to Boots, I don't think you'd resent it. Sadly, no connection to a failed UK chain in this one though. I was tempted to try and work in some tortured fake story about low-quality supermarket outlet quick save, especially as the fate of that was also to be bought by another company which then in itself collapsed. But I think that would have been even more niche a reference. Dizzy Panic. Pac-Man was many people's first video game. So how do you follow up a pair of knockoff Pac-Mans? Pac-Men? Well, that's simple. You knock off the first game of any type most of us ever played. This, the video game. You're intrigued, aren't you? You possibly shouldn't be. On their re-evaluation in this issue, AA gave Fast Food 66 and Quick Snaps 76. Panic Dizzy? 12. The duties here passed from the Oliver twins over to Big Red, who were already busy on the adventures by this point in the timeline. Too busy to write a coherent game, it seems. Panic Dizzy is as simple can be. Here's the start of the game. Shapes come out the tubes, you position the holes, and hit drop. If multiple shapes can be dropped, the game will do it for you. Clear enough shapes, as you can see from the thing in the top right there, and you go to the next level, where things get a bit quicker and sometimes you get extra types of shapes. It's pleasingly mind-numbing, I guess. The most interesting thing about it, though, is, before I played it, I watched some of it on YouTube thanks to the glorious RZX archive. And it turns out that was the Spectrum version, which has one crucial advantage. Colour. The different kinds of shapes have their own distinct colour on the Specky, and I suspect once things get very busy, you'd come very quickly to rely on that. Back on the CPC, it's all red. Very red. I don't know if this is a decision to benefit green monitor owners, but especially given the low resolution, and especially given you're going to be playing this on an old CRT, I'm not even sure you're going to be able to recognise all the shapes that quick. I'm not going to 12% this game, as it were. But if you're old enough to drink from a cup without a safety spout on it, you don't need to hunt this one down at all. Weirdly, for Baby's first game, it might actually be a good one, but it may not bode well that I had to use ancient footage of my under 2-year-old nephew a minute ago, because he's already well bored of the real-life version. In any case, even if you do inflict this on your spawn, you'll want it to be the Spectrum one. The really weird thing though is, when Codemasters came to choose an adventure game and 2 spin-offs to put on that previously mentioned Game Gear compilation, they chose this over anything you've seen so far. In November 1993. I don't think I need to start listing what else you could be playing on a Game Gear by November 1993, but let me wave frantically at games like Columns and Mean Bean Machine for 2. Codemasters literally vetoed the Oliver's plan to use the then unreleased adventure game Wonderland Dizzy on this compilation in favour of this. Wonderland wouldn't see a release of any kind until 2015. No wonder the twins and Codemasters parted ways shortly after. Bubble Dizzy. Now, this one I was dreading, and not just for the very clear downward trend in the games to this point. But no, I was dreading this one because I distinctly remember RoseTintedSpectrum looking at it and spending 8 minutes basically iterating every reason it doesn't work as a game, and fundamentally the wrong thing to even consider making in the first place. The premise here is pretty simple. A standard mainline Dizzy game consisted of, from most to least loved, some puzzle solving, some exploration, some inventory management, and a little bit of platforming. Bubble Dizzy transplants the platforming into its own game. That's like looking at a Gran Turismo style racing game, with its close racing, unbelievable speed, huge noise and spectacular locations, and thinking what people really want to play is a game where you spend your time changing the wheels and filling up the car with fuel in a dark garage. Okay, poor example. But Bubble Dizzy isn't just a Dizzy platformer. In fact, the actual platform controls are, if anything, marginally improved from the originals. It's not a bad looking game either, set entirely underwater, with no explanation as to how Dizzy doesn't immediately expire like he famously does in the main games. On CPC at least, it's got a grimy dark feel that's actually a touch opposed to the CPC's normal colour palette, and is quite effective. The problem is, it's simply not a fair game. Your inputs do not really correspond to your success. Let me back up. You're underwater, Dizzy. The plan is to jump on the bubbles and ride them up to the surface, at which point you'll jump straight into another trench. There's enemies to avoid and solid platforms at the side in some places to stand on. There's an effective time limit dictated by oxygen melting away, which the enemies can also steal from you somehow. And it doesn't work as a game because your success is, to a huge degree, down to luck. Look, Rosie will explain it.
Bubbles are platforms. They are your key to getting to the next level. Do you know where the bubbles are going to rise? No. Do you know which bubbles are going to rise? No. To add more frustration to this, enemies are placed in your path, and honestly, for the most part, you just have to ignore the fact they're there. You can't do anything about it. If you move or jump out of the way, your bubble will pop, which means you'll just have to wait for another bubble to arrive in the exact place you want.
So you have to ignore the enemies and hope they don't kill you, because it's not like you can do anything really concrete to avoid them, since the vast majority of your movement will be external. And whether or not you can reach the next platform at any given point is sheer luck as to whether your bubble will hold up. And none of this translates to a satisfying game. In any given life, whether you succeed is pretty much entirely within the gift of the random number generator doing the bubbles, and it is random, something it's very easy to prove by rerunning the fun. You can see the idea, really you can, but you can't have a platform game with randomised destruction of platforms and a consistent target. It's just not satisfying. Even adding a flashing effect to warn you or a countdown somewhere could transform it, but right now I'm calling it a worse video game than Panic Dizzy. Because Panic Dizzy is something you can play with consistent rules, even if they're consistent rules my baby nephew can deal with. This? Failure is not your fault, and thus success, if it comes, is not your achievement. Dizzy Down the Rapids. This, the more savvy amongst you may have spotted, is not an Amstrad CPC game. This is the arcade game Tubin, which as a Brit I'm struggling mightily to pronounce in a way that makes you understand exactly how it's spelled. It's a 1988 arcade game by Atari Midway involving storming down the world's least friendly water park lazy river, avoiding enemies, collecting bonuses, and generally having a lovely time. It's the kind of thing that looks ripe for a well done home conversion. And indeed several formats, including our host, got one. And here it is. It's not perfect, but it's an admirable attempt. The control system is a little weird, involving you individually controlling your hero's arms, and the collision detection isn't what it might be. But by and large, the problems with this are also the problems with the arcade game itself, in terms of being unfair, having a restricted viewpoint a lot of the time, and having collision detection which, to be polite, is not 100% spot on. Given the length of this section already, you might wonder why we're talking about this. But don't worry, we won't be here long now. 2 years after this conversion, Codemasters were sent a second knockoff conversion that I presume was bashed out in an afternoon. It shows some technical competence, and what a normal company would have done is hired the guy to do a proper project. What they did was slap the Dizzy name and character graphic on it, throw in some music and chuck the game out the door. It's awful. It's slow. The river is generally so narrow that avoiding enemies is impossible. It's a bad game. It might even be worse than Bubble Dizzy. At least Bubble Dizzy was just a bad design. The game actually played okay. This is awful. And even worse, it's an awful clone of something you could already pick up on Hit Squad. There is one more, but thankfully for all of us, the CPC didn't get it. We'll cover this another time because it's the third title on that unreleased Master System collection too, but Go Dizzy Go is a puzzle game most akin to Quick Snacks of the Dizzy games. I will say it at least looks better than the last three we suffered through. But having talked about Dizzy for a bit, let's talk about Not Dizzy. So you'd think, having released what will settle on as being 13 Dizzy games in 5 years, Codemasters would have released enough egg-based products and certainly enough action platformer adventure puzzlers. But no. In development at Big Red had been yet another Dizzy game, Movie Land Dizzy, a neat piece of sequel naming following as it did Magic Land Dizzy. The Olivers, though, had half the IP rights to Dizzy, and they stipulated that Dizzy would always remain a fantasy character, never intruding onto anything that could be considered the real world, and thus they vetoed the game. The solution was simple. Perform some legally distinct changes and make their own game. Given 3 months, Big Red stripped out some of the Dizzy finery, but reused a bunch of the locations and the basic game engine. The character, though, for want of a more precise description, was changed from an egg to a slightly more detailed potato, and Seymour was born. To put it mildly, if another company had made this game, they'd have been sued instantly, and I wonder if it contributed to the imminent departure of the Oliver twins from Codemasters. Technically, our gaming heaven this month is a compilation of all 5 of the Seymour-based games that were released in the space of barely a year. But I want to focus on that first one, which emerged as Seymour Goes to Hollywood in English-speaking countries and Seymour at the Movies elsewhere. Your immediate impression on playing Seymour is that it's so far so dizzy. My head is spinning. Like a whirlpool, it never... Oh, sorry, got distracted for a second there. But the initial starter puzzle, where the security guard doesn't recognise you and you have to step back a screen and find your shades in your limo so he recognises you, is essentially out of any Dizzy game you could name. This shouldn't be surprising, of course, for a game that literally runs on the engine Big Red developed for the later 8-bit Dizzy games, and nor is it, in and of itself, a bad thing. Although given the sheer number of Dizzy games being released, you'd hope it had something more to make it stand out. And it does. But in both directions. The receptionist won't talk to us because she's in a strop, and we walk right to discover Problem 1, a broken lift. Problem 2 comes shortly thereafter. Tarzan is blocking access to the one place it seems like we can go, and we can't understand what he's asking for. They say the correct way to give bad news is to sandwich it between 2 pieces of good news, lovingly termed the shit sandwich. Well, this game is a bit different. I need to give you 2 bad pieces of news, sandwiched between some good. I'm not sure what that is. I'm very sure most of the prevailing theories in my brain would get me banned from YouTube, so let's just call it a delicious cheese sandwich, but they've used one of those awful supermarket value brand brown breads that basically taste like white bread but worse. The first bread slice, oh screw it, I'm committed to this now. The first bread slice is this, the main hub world, which contains links to all the studios you'll visit during the course of the game. It's as advertised, a maze. But it's an awful one, in that if you move right a screen and then exit that screen left, you might not actually end up in the same place you started. Also, this is the time to point out that much like some of the Dizzy games, the CPC version is weirdly colourless compared to the Spectrum one, and unfortunately, that is key information to help you solve said maze. It's weird too. Colour was the CPC's thing. The Spectrum versions of things used monochromatic graphics a lot to help the system deliver its trademark speedy gameplay and avoid colour clash. The C64 versions, of course, were... oh, let's not start another fight. The CPC versions were pleasantly understated. The CPC is the one that usually threw a big blob of welcome colour all over the place, but not here. In the end, I gave quite a lot of up, and went to look for a guide, and they were all for the Spectrum version, the best of which I found was this, and I ended up reverse engineering the whole thing by continuously exiting up and noting where I appeared on the new screen. Nonetheless, we do make our way through, and in the process find our quarry, a translation dictionary. Using it on Tarzan does nothing, so we take it to the receptionist, who will apparently now talk to us. She speed Duolingos us, and we return to a much more friendly King of the Jungle. Tarzan's village is where our delicious cheese filling occurs. Having overstressed the idiot platforming of Dizzy in Bubble Dizzy, Big Red have gone the other way here. While there are platforming sections, they do make sense once you get to know them, and are mostly enemy-free, meaning you can concentrate on your traversal instead. Which is good, because those controls aren't better than Dizzy's. And that's nice. It turns this into more of a point-and-click style adventure, if anything. It does have problems when viewed like that. It's difficult to see items on the screen, for instance, and your pathetic 3-item carrying capacity makes it necessary to nominate a location or two as a storage area. The game has access to the whole keyboard. It'll use multiple keys later for stuff like the lift, but it still insists on having just the one use key, which will drop whatever is in the first slot, meaning inventory management via swapping. A remarkable oversight. Nonetheless, on a return trip to ransack Tarzan's village, we find a spanner, which feels like it'll be useful to repair that lift. And so it proves, allowing us to explore the office building, where there are another 4 items to be found. A piece of maths you'll probably already have done and come to the conclusion hidden within our rapidly going stale second slice of supermarket brown. There's a lot of busy work traversal in this game. We're 30 minutes in and already I've had to do multiple ferrying trips into Tarzan's village, and you'll need to make a 5-screen journey back and forth just to the lift at least twice to get the stuff from the office, some of which is hidden down clever but tedious and entirely peril-free twisting paths. And here's where we leave it. I never like to show too far into a game in Yesterzine, because the idea is to help you decide whether this is a game you want to play. And if I show you the end, that doesn't work at all. The entrance to the first movie set, Greece, feels like a good place. So should you? Well, if you were any fan of Dizzy but overlooked this series, then very yes. If you like a point-and-click type game and can overlook the busy work, then, well, yeah. The game isn't overwhelmingly huge. Those movie sets are maybe about 7 screens each, making for a total of 96 in the game. So with a bit of note-taking, you could probably keep a pretty good track of items, and the puzzles so far, minus the specific layout of that maze, aren't too daft. Your Sinclair actually theorised this was partially due to the real-world setting. Speaking historically, that you could pay £4 for this embarrasses, I'd say, the majority of full-price 8-bit games. Amstrad Action's verdict on the full compilation is a bit weird. At $12.99, it cost as much as a little over 3 of its 5 games on release, and no doubt you could have found a couple of the earlier ones on clearance in your local boots. I can't stress how different a world this was. Given they gift 2 of the games 47 and 38%, why would you not just buy the 3 pretty good games on their own? Now, it'd be a nice thing to have. These 5 titles were ultimately the only 5 Seymour games to be released, as Big Red moved first into another of their original games for Codemasters, in CJ the Elephant, and then into a tie-up with Domark, which ultimately resulted in them selling the business to Eidos, when Eidos acquired Domark. 80s kids will remember the TV series Danger Mouse, a slightly absurdist tale of a secret agent rodent, starring famous UK stuntman David Jason.
Play it nice and cool, son. Nice and cool, you know what I mean?
The series' general humour is a lot to answer for, certainly in terms of this show, but also for many people of a certain age. In one episode, there was a vegetarian vampire duck called Count Duckula, which I think neatly demonstrates my point about the sense of humour. The character was popular and spawned a spin-off series starring famous UK stuntman David Jason.
Play it nice and cool, son. Nice and cool, you know what I mean?
And as is the way of these things, there were video games. And, as is the way of these things, they were cartoony platformers. And if Amstrad Action is to be believed this month, as is the way of these things, they were dreadful. The 12% given to Panic Dizzy doesn't come close to making it the worst thing in the episode, because this normally fairly placid and upbeat magazine gives Count Duckula 2 a full 3%. That is a real Amiga power of a mark. And it's a real Amiga power of a review too, taking the form of a mock trial, which declares the game to be the single worst of all time on the CPC, and given we are 8 years into the machine's life, there is a lot to choose from. But let's be fair. Let's start a game and what? What is this? Who is this? Why is it running at 2 frames a second? Why is this a walking animation? How do I do any of this? None of it works well. I make a few spirited attempts to treat it like a real platformer, but the controls couldn't be less responsive if the control method was to send someone a postcard asking how they are, and if they could perhaps please see their way to pushing up if they would be so kind and it's not too much trouble, no rush. And it is up to jump, of course, because fire, eventually, fires ketchup apparently. That's not a joke. That's what it's supposed to be. Vegetarian vampire, remember? Duckula even having a gun is actually contrary to his general personality in the TV series, but since that's not in the top 10 of crimes here, let's gloss over that. The game can't do animation, to the point that all the platforms simply wink in and out of existence with no warning. To the extent that to get up to this platform the way you would think you should, you'd have to time a jump, because it's not going to carry you there. In reality, I do it accidentally, by mastering the split-second timing required to land and shoot this guy, at which point I'm picked up and carried here, where I can't jump. The game makes the noise, but you don't move, and as far as I can tell, you can't get to those enemies any other way, since arcane concepts like inertia and moving in the air are not something this platformer has any truck with. Not happening. The answer doesn't appear to be in the last screen either, despite my briefly managing to get old Duckles wedged in a wall. I quit and read the manual. So the picking up and carrying thing is the one use only of Count Duckula's superhero friend Tremendous Terrence. So we were actually supposed to be able to judge the jumping across those platforms, which again give you no notice of their actions. So you'd have to count time and jump in what I would guess to be maybe a quarter-second window, blind, on screen 1, of a kid's game, which I am playing in easy mode. The absolute shit alternative? Is this what your name means? The practical alternative to gameplay? To fun? To making something that isn't a tedious trial and error hellhole that hates you and everything you stand for? Checking on YouTube for help, I can't help notice that while there's a few reviews, almost all of which start from the premise they're making fun of an awful game, the usual likes of World of Longplays are conspicuously missing from this one. No one has wanted to complete this. Two chums of the channel have tried. Nefarious gets exactly as far as I have so far. Ginny Vision, as always, is using real hardware, so if my issues are emulator, he won't have them. He has them. Both of them are as surprised by Terrence as I am. Yeah, we're done here. It's not the same machine, I grant you, and this was cheaper, but when this game came out, Sonic the Hedgehog literally existed. But more to the point, so did Count Duckula 1, which at least looks like a game. We don't prejudge here at YZ. We've had several lowest scorers being games well worth playing for one reason or another. This is not. Unless you want the morbid curiosity of seeing if this really is as bad as I'm saying, and I can assure you it is, do not. Play something else. Play Rise of the Sodding Robots even. Play Bubble Dizzy. Play Panic Dizzy. There's no over-the-top Yesterzine hyperbole for humorous effect here. This is unredeemable. Even the 1% winning Ultraman from a year or two back just about functions as a video game. This fundamentally doesn't. Amstrad Action said they'd laugh it out of the office if submitted as a basic type-in. I suggest you do exactly the same. Wow, that was a long one, wasn't it? Misses. So in lieu of a full Backpage advert, I've got some people to thank. The car mechanic sim footage came straight from Mike at RetroSesh. He's been streaming this one lately, and if you don't want to see him work on virtual cars at twitch.tv/RetroSesh, maybe see him working on his soon-to-be-lovely Reliant Scimitar in the totally not strained pun series Reincarnation, now on its very own channel. And of course, the voice of the manual, Bloggo's pal, a man who you have to thank for more of my stupidity than you think, thanks to his habit of saying, "do it," whenever I come up with an awful idea. Because he doesn't write 6,500-word scripts about an Amstrad magazine, you can catch his conversational game roundup videos every Saturday morning. Start on Twitter at Bloggo's pal. You saw a clip from RoseTintedSpectrum on Bubble Dizzy. He's done several more of these games, including a more considered view of Seymour Goes to Hollywood and some of the Dizzies. They're all worth your eyeballs. Literally, I hear that's what he charges on Patreon. And finally, my nephew Sammy cannot be reached on Twitter. He does not possess a YouTube channel. But he's still my nephew, so he does already have his first console, this knockoff Sony PSP that can just about run NES games on a good day. for he must be taught early that life is pain. To make life marginally less painful, please sub and bell to this channel and all of theirs, especially if the really dumb idea I've had for mid-month comes to fruition. Whether it does or not, let's meet back here the last Friday in September to talk about the contents of another video game magazine from the Golden Age. In the meantime, if you catch this quick and you're at Digitizer Live next week, please come say hello. I'll be the only idiot in a Yesterzine sweatshirt, because only one exists. Ta-ra!